The Bible reading today comes from Mark chapter 6, and it's from verse 30 to 44. So Jesus feeds the 5,000. The apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all they had done and taught. Then Jesus said, "Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while." He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. But many people recognized them and saw them leaving, and people from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat." But Jesus said, "You feed them." "With what?" they asked. "We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people." "How much bread do you have?" he asked. "Go and find out." They came back and reported, "We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of 50 or 100. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed from those loaves.
Thank you, Julie, for reading, and Steve leading us in prayer, for our band leading us in singing. It's been a great time together. If you're here, as Carissa already has said, if you're here as a visitor with us this afternoon, a guest, then welcome. It's great to have you, and please hang around after the service so that we can get to know you a little bit. That's great. Baptism Sunday on March the 24th, I had the privilege this afternoon of baptising somebody down in Burrell Lake. It's a wonderful testimony as Philip this afternoon chose in front of family and friends to be baptised, and more or less showing by that visual that you have died to yourself and died with Christ, and as you rise up out of the water, the symbolism of I am now living for Jesus. So the 24th of March, we're going to be having a few folk being baptised, and if that's something that you would like to explore, please don't hesitate to come and have a yarn. We are going to be continuing our talks, our series in growing disciples, and so for those at home watching and for us here tonight, just recognise that you might go away thinking, oh, what about this, what about that, what about the other? Well, this is a series of 7 different talks, so I'm not going to cover everything today, but I am going to be looking at the topic, what does a growing disciple need? What kind of things need to be evident to indicate that we are growing as followers of Jesus? Let me say that again. What kind of things need to be evident to indicate that we are growing followers of Jesus? So that's where we're going tonight. This amazing miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 must have impacted the disciples quite incredibly, because this is, apart from the crucifixion narrative and the resurrection narrative, this is the only one of the miracles that is across all 4 Gospels. Now, the reason why I'm over here with the pen in hand is I want to write that word up, gospel. Do you know what gospel means, somebody? Good news, very good. So, good news is the meaning. Good news. But we often talk about the gospel, or we can talk about gospels. And the gospels are also good news, but they are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the first 4 books of the New Testament, and they are good news as those 4 different writers wrote about the life and ministry of Jesus. Mark is the only one who was not a disciple, but it was through Peter that Mark wrote his letter, the book of Mark. And so just to understand that we sometimes use those words a little bit interchangeably. The Gospels often indicate Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospel is the good news about Jesus that we share with people. The only time that you might see Gospel mentioned the other way is when we talk about the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew. Everybody okay? Stunned mullet, that's good. And so I want to just give you a brief overview of this passage. And I want to start back a little bit earlier in Mark chapter 6, where Jesus has sent out the 12 disciples. Back in chapter 3, he has selected the 12 disciples, those who will accompany him, and I'll talk about that again in a moment. But now he sends them out in mission. And it tells us here, he called his 12 disciples together, verse 7, and began sending them out 2 by 2, giving them authority to cast out evil spirits. He told them to take nothing for their journey except a walking stick, no food, no traveller's bag, no money. He allowed them to wear sandals, but not to take a change of clothes, and so on. He sends them out into the villages around Galilee, the lake, to basically share the good news of the kingdom and to ask their Jewish relatives, their Jewish people that they were a part of, to turn, repent, and to turn back to God again. And so they go out, and Jesus sends them out, the 12. Later, he will send out the 72. And all the while, Jesus is working through discipling these different ones. But while they're out on mission, a dreadful thing happens. Down on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, in what is known as the castle of Machaerus, Herod beheads John the Baptizer. And John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, is Jesus' cousin, if you'll remember. And so the disciples return from their mission, and Jesus would have been grieving. And it says here, the apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry in verse 30, from their ministry tour, and told him all they had done and taught. And then Jesus said, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while. And you get that kind of sense of, oh, wouldn't that be nice? And so their idea is that they will go around the lake in a boat, the 12 together with Jesus. They'll get away from the crowds. We're even told here that they didn't even have enough time to eat. There were so many people coming and going. So they left by a boat. They went around to this quiet place, but people heard, people saw. And they continued to gather and chase them, in a sense, follow them around the edge of the lake, such that when they finally pulled into shore, Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat. And we're told he had compassion on them. Why? Because he saw them as sheep without a shepherd, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. He began to teach them many things. The afternoon must have gone on, and Jesus had poured himself out to these people through the late morning and into the afternoon, and now it's evening. The disciples come to him late in the afternoon and they say, look, send them away. It's a remote place, they need to go and get some tucker, send them home. And Jesus says these most amazing words, verse 37, you feed them. Yeah, how would you and I go with that one? You feed them. Well, they talk about money and the wage that it would take to feed all this crowd, and Jesus simply then says, okay, well, what are your provisions? Go and find out what's there amongst the crowd. 2 fish, 5 loaves. What are we going to do with this? And so Jesus tells the disciples to get the people to sit down. Verse 39, then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. The word groups there in Greek is like a vegetable garden. So here are the people in their 50s and 100s being sat down by the disciples in a nice kind of orderly fashion. And Jesus begins by praying, and then it simply says, then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. In the kingdom of God, there is always enough. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. Where did they get these baskets? We often imagine, going around and collecting the baskets, and afterwards they've got 12 of them, But these baskets were what was called kophinos. They were worn by most Jewish males, particularly those who were really Jewish, because in their kophinos, which was slung over their back, it had a narrow mouth and then opened out into a larger basket woven together. In that, they would carry their meal if they were travelling. And they were assured that that meal was sacrificially okay. It was good to eat. It had been made kosher. Of course, we're late in the afternoon here. Many of them had been travelling since early in the day, and all the food was gone. And we have 12 basketfuls left over. Why? Well, there was probably one for each of the disciples. Each of the disciples carried a kophinos, a basket, and had filled their various baskets with leftovers. It's interesting that back in Mark chapter 6, Jesus says to his disciples as he sends them out, he told them to take nothing for their journey except a walking stick, no food, no traveller's bag, is probably the kophinos. It's an amazing story when you think, here is Jesus wanting some time to grieve, wanting some time to talk through how the disciples had gone in their time of mission, and yet the crowd is there. Let's talk for a moment about what is a disciple. If I was to ask you, how would you define a disciple of Jesus? If you're a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, how would we define that? I'm not going to ask for answers out loud, and to which you say, thank you, Doug. But if we go back into Mark chapter 3, verse 14, a few weeks ago I spoke about this, where Jesus selected his 12 disciples after a night of prayer. He comes down off the mountain and he calls to himself 12 who became his disciples, and it simply says they were to accompany him. A disciple, if you're a disciple of Jesus, as I am, if you're a follower of Jesus, then a part of discipleship is simply to accompany Jesus, to walk with him through our life's journey, to spend time alone with him, to give ourselves afresh to him each day. And as I said on that particular Sunday, if we are to accompany Jesus, then we can't accompany other stuff. We can't follow Jesus and follow other things as well. He needs to be our attention, our focus. So, a part of being a disciple is to accompany him. A disciple, though, is also someone who is following Jesus, who is being changed by Jesus, and who is committed to the mission of Jesus. Now I'm going to write that up here. What do you think? Okay, just in case people want to write it down. A disciple is someone who is following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and who is about the mission of Jesus. Now, do you know how I remember that? Mark chapter 1, verse 17. Jesus is going past the boats where Peter, James and John and so on are, and he says a simple command. Do you remember it? Follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Mark 1, 17. If you'd like to kind of remember that, it's not like Mark 1:17 was written so that we could have this, but it does help us to understand something of what a disciple is. Someone who follows Jesus, someone who is being changed by Jesus in that sense of I will make you, if you're willing, if you're humble and come before me, if you'll listen to me, obey me, if you'll submit to my leadership and my lordship, then he will make us, and about his mission, making them into fishers of men, those who will come to know God through Jesus. Discipleship takes place whenever biblical truth is shared. Discipleship takes place whenever biblical truth is shared. Or, there's a part B, where one encourages another into a deeper level of obedience to Christ. Where one encourages another into a deeper level of obedience to Christ. Let me say the whole thing together. Discipleship takes place whenever biblical truth is shared, or where one encourages another into a deeper level of obedience to Christ. So yes, discipleship is taking place now, I hope. But if you're having a coffee with a brother or sister in Christ or somebody through the week, and you're sharing biblical truth, or you're encouraging them into a deeper walk of obedience with the Lord, then you're about discipleship. So, today we are looking at the issue of what do we need to be cultivating in our lives as we seek to be growing ourselves and helping others to grow. I'm going to take for granted the fact that we know as disciples that we need to be spending time alone with God. That's a given. What do we need? As we seek to follow Jesus, as we seek to be his disciples, we need time alone with him. We need time in his word. We need time in prayer. We need time in meditation and silence. We need to be listening to what the Spirit of God is saying in our lives. We need the will to say, I will change in accordance to the Scriptures. Time alone with God is a given. But some other things that come from these passages are, we need a growing faith. We need to be on a growing edge of faith. What do I mean by that? Jesus, right through the Gospels, Jesus pushes his disciples to greater faith. And we need to be doing that with one another, yes, but we also need to be open to the Spirit of God pushing us to a deeper level of faith. So we see back in chapter 6 and verse 8, he told them, again, to take nothing for their journey except a walking stick, no food, no traveller's bag, no money. He allowed them to wear sandals, but not to take a change of clothes. They were to go on mission, focused on mission, and in going, they were not to worry about their provision. God would take care of them. Are we up to that kind of faith? In the middle of the story that was read to us, but Jesus said, you feed them. I don't know how I would go with that. You feed them. Is it any wonder that the disciples immediately revert to money and the amount of money it would take to feed this crowd? It just was not even in their psyche. It was not in their thinking that Jesus would do what he was going to do. But I put it to you, as I've had to think it through myself, Jesus was not asking them to do something that he didn't believe could be done. And then it's interesting, the story that follows on. You see, at the end of this particular day, Jesus tells his disciples to head off in the boat and to go across the lake. At the same time, Jesus finally is able to pursue what he'd originally tried to do, and that is he goes up the mountain and he spends time alone with his Father. He still pursues that time with God. And that night, as he comes down off the mountain, he sees on the lake that the disciples are in distress. They're in the boat, rowing, the waves are getting bigger, and they're in strife. But then it says that Jesus walks out onto the water, and then we have verse 48. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. He intended to go past them. I find those kind of things amazing. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They're in distress out on the lake, and he's intending to go past them. Why? I put it to you that it's because back in chapter 4, only 3 chapters earlier, Jesus, on the boat with them, has calmed the storm. Peace be still. And his disciples are just left going, who is this? Who is this? Why is he intending to just walk past them? Because he's shown them what to do. And he wants their faith to grow. He wants the disciples to understand that they too can pray to the Father for their safety, that things might settle. And so in the story, Jesus comes over, he gets into the boat with them, and the storm settles. Oh, there's so many things that we could kind of draw out of that. He wants to grow our faith. He wants your faith and my faith to be on a growing edge as we continue on through life. Folk, let me urge you, don't fall into the trap of doing Christianity like a treadmill. You've all seen on the old movies a horse and walking there, and it's on a slight incline, and this kind of elevator thing keeps on moving under its feet, and over somewhere there is a machine that's turning around and working because this horse is on its treadmill, and there's a basket of hay just there, but he can never quite get to it because he's on a treadmill. And it's like some Christians that are working towards heaven, but they're going nowhere. Jesus pushes the disciples in their faith, and he calls us to a deeper level of faith as we go on through life. And I don't know about you, it could be in relation to money. To give at a greater sacrificial level and trust God for what he will do in providing for you. It may be at a different level of obedience, obeying his call, listening and moving towards people that he's calling you to speak with or to get to know. It may be in the issue of prayer. Maybe you've prayed kind of rote prayers all your life, little dinky sort of prayers. Maybe he's asking you to go into a deeper level of prayer, to pray for the healing of somebody, to pray earnestly for the salvation of somebody, to change the way you sit and get down and kneel or get prostrate on the floor before him. Maybe it's simply believing that God can, that God will. Growing in faith is something that is a part of the walk of discipleship. The other thing that we see through this story here is that Jesus was about changing their heart attitude, the heart attitude of us and of the disciples. I don't know you don't know me, we don't know one another's heads and what we think about different things and some of the stuff that goes through our heads, but God is about changing our hearts, our heart attitude. He calls his disciples to change their hearts, hearts that would be compassionate, hearts that would serve, hearts that would be humble, hearts that would be teachable. And he wants the same for us. It's fascinating when you look at verse 34, Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That is a dreadful picture. A sheep without a shepherd. A sheep is a dependent animal, and without a shepherd to protect it, to take care of it, to tend it, they're dead. Wolves and other animals can attack them. They can grow their wool out to the point where flies start to lay their eggs into the wet wool, and eventually they bury themselves into the live animal and their blood becomes tainted. And sheep in Australia at least can become wool blind, as I've said before, so grown over in their eyes that they can't see where they're going. And unless they're shorn and tended, that wool will just keep growing and growing and growing. Sheep without a shepherd. Jesus shows compassion. What is the disciples' view of things? Verse 35, late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away." I shouldn't laugh, should I? Jesus gets out of the boat and he pours himself into this crowd all late morning and afternoon because of compassion. And the disciples come and say, "Get rid of this mob, will you?" He teaches them to serve. And here, yes, they serve. They serve and obey Jesus by doing the things that he asks them to do around the crowd. But later on in John chapter 13, in the upper room, just the night before he will be crucified, Jesus will wash their feet. And he'll say, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many." What you've seen me do, you need to do to one another. Changing of the heart. He wants us to be teachable, malleable, and not just in the head, not just to know stuff, but to say and speak out and live out the change that comes. Obedience is a third thing, of course. And again, through this particular passage, we see the obedience of the disciples in the small things. And gradually they will be taken into a deeper level of obedience. Let me finish by simply giving one more that's not there, that I believe is crucial for us if we are to be functioning disciples of Jesus. And that is that we need to be both healing and healed. We need to be both healing and healed. Back in the earlier part of chapter 6 there, Jesus sends them out to kind of go pack lightly, He says, take nothing for your journey, just a walking stick, no food, no traveller's bag, just go yourselves. Travel light. But too many Christians today are travelling with the burdens of the past still stuck on their back. Unforgiveness, unconfessed sin, grudges, the stuff that we hold from the past. And that stuff too needs to be cleaned up and given back to God. We need to be able to learn what it is to forgive people, just as Christ forgave us freely. A part of the Lord's Prayer is that we might be forgiven as we have forgiven others. Otherwise, we just track on through life with these thumping big backpacks on us. And we need to be able to confess sin where there is repeated habitual sin. We need to get before God, get with brothers and sisters in Christ and make ourselves accountable and deal with some of that stuff. Because on the journey of discipleship, we need to travel light. Not just, travelling light in the physical, but we need to travel light in the spiritual. Well, there's lots more in the series to come, but that's all for tonight.